What are the dynamics at play here?
Well, it's absolutely right. It is desperate, but the sad thing about it is that none of this is surprising. Shaun Pinner and Aiden Aslin will have known perfectly well when they surrendered in Mariupol that they had little chance of escaping without potential torture and murder, but the alternative, of course, was certain death among the defenders of Azovstal. And yes, it's not surprising that Russia will attempt to leverage this in any way that it can, because Russia itself is in a desperate position and is clutching at straws to try to alleviate its own situation. And of course, this is only a small part of that process. Think of the much larger scale at which Russia is blackmailing the rest of the world, like withholding food supplies from Ukraine to feed tens of millions of people across Asia and Africa. And even these two British citizens and Ukrainian citizens as well, and servicemen in the Ukrainian military, are just a small part of the much bigger picture, where so many other defenders of Mariupol have disappeared into this Stalinist system of repression that Russia is re-establishing. They're the people we feel most directly and strongly for here in the UK, but they're just one among hundreds and thousands of people in similar situations.
Yes, it's clearly a very, very desperate situation. I wonder if the desperacity, if that's a word, if the desperation of the Russian Federation comes from their lack of success, the stalemate, in effect, in how they have been able to take only parts of the east and south of the country. I mean, Russia's not doing well in this war.
Well, let's not forget that it is a fair chunk of Ukraine that they already have control of, and also that it's not necessarily on the battlefield that this war is going to be determined, because Russia still has this stranglehold on the Ukrainian economy, and it can grind its way forward simply through mass, through pushing so many untrained troops and so much artillery firepower into the conflict that they can continue to inch Ukraine backwards. And of course, then it's a trial of stamina and of patience, and it's the West, the backers of Ukraine in the West, that needs to keep up the fighting, keep Ukraine going, not only in terms of weapons supplies to keep it fighting, but also to keep it going as a functional state and a functional economy. And that's where compassion fatigue in the West is probably the biggest threat that Ukraine faces at the moment.
It looks like we've got much compassion fatigue in the United Kingdom, or indeed in the United States. However, we are starting to see some voices in the European Union who are talking more about the damaging effects of sanctions on domestic economies, not just Russia. Of course, sanctions work both ways. Is there a risk that the West has less stamina for the long haul than Russia does? Being an autocracy, it's very easy to set a direction of travel and stick to it, whereas democracies tend to be a little bit more messy in this aspect.
That's exactly right. For countries like the UK, the direction is clear, and what we need to do to support Ukraine is clear. But then we have to drag along the flakier members of the EU, for example, with us. And they have always been focused on the fact that this war in Ukraine actually gets in the way of their comfortable life and making a profit. And they've been unwilling to take on the costs not only of economic support to Ukraine, not only of imposing sanctions, but also of actually delivering that military support that Ukraine needs. And that's a problem that has been bad, but is only going to get worse. So preserving that Western unity, which is that additional challenge to supporting Ukraine, has to be one of the biggest priorities for Ukraine in gathering its supporters to continue this war.
Interesting, this war has been going on for quite some time now, and what makes the news versus what doesn't seem to be sort of the novel aspects of this war. We know people have been dying every day. We know that the fighting has been intense, but it's the capture and the sentencing of these two Brits that has really brought this back to the forefront of the news, that then again makes us think about what has been going on pretty relentlessly for the last few months. How many more Brits is the estimate that are fighting out there in Ukraine? Might there be more Brits captured? Have there been people who are either living there to start with, as these people were, or indeed who have gone out to fight against the advice of the British government, it has to be said, but gone out to fight, as we know some have? Do we have any idea of the numbers involved?
It's possible. I don't know those figures, but let's not forget it's not only people fighting on the front lines, but also people who are putting themselves in harm's way for Ukraine, and thus for the defense of Europe, who are not actually in uniform. The aid workers, the humanitarian workers, the people who are trying to keep Ukraine's economy going, all of them, if they are close to an area that is under threat by Russia, are at risk themselves. And whether or not they're actually signed up as Ukrainian servicemen, they could fall into exactly the same situation we're seeing here. It is an act of bravery to go and support Ukraine in whichever way in an area that is within reach of Russia.
No, it's certainly very, very brave, although, of course, against the advice of the British government. I suppose, just finally in this conversation, that very much limits what the British government can do here. We're not expecting some sort of prisoner swap. We're not expecting the United Kingdom to want to give Russia something in exchange for these prisoners.
I've not seen anything that indicates exactly what the British government is planning to do in response, other than obviously protest. This is something which you can't measure against any known standards of morality or justice. This is a simple, straightforward act of terrorism and of blackmail against the West. How the British government responds is going to be determined, of course, by the way the British government has responded to terrorists in the past.